It is wonderful to be back with you again. It was great to be here this morning and get to, I think I said this morning, but to meet a lot of you for the first time and get to know you a little bit, to meet some of you for the second or third time and get to know you a bit better, and to see some wonderful dear old friends again, and reminisce and catch up and just enjoy each other's company. We were able to spend the afternoon with the cooks, which was balm for the soul, shall we say. I can't say how wonderful it's been for my family and for me to be here with you, and how much we appreciate the support that you give, the financial support, of course, but we know that we have your support in your prayers and your sort of moral and spiritual support as you are invested in the work that we're doing in the same way that we are. There were a couple of things that I kind of felt like I left out from the report phase and just trying to get you to know me a little bit, know me and my work and my family. And I can't remember who it was now, but just before we started this evening, somebody had, I was meeting him and he was saying, and how many kids do you have? Is it 4? And I went, yeah, that would have been a useful thing to mention. No, I've got 6. One of the crazy people. 6 kids, and I think I've told this story to a few people already today, that I grew up with 3 sisters, and I just thought 4 kids it's really too many. It's too many, you know. It's all a jumble, everything's chaos, and each kid doesn't get a full share of the parents' attention. And I think my maximum is going to be about 3. Yeah, well, so much for that. And I'm so glad that my mind was changed on that, and I'm so thrilled to have all of these precious little souls that have been entrusted to me and to my wife, and to be able to raise them and to see God's glory through them, and to, in some ways, we get to relive our own childhood with a better understanding of what it meant and what we were doing and what was really important. And then, as I'm sure a lot of you have realized, even if you haven't put it in exactly these terms, you get the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of your parents and your grandparents, because you know that your parents weren't perfect. You know that your grandparents weren't perfect, and you get to learn from the good things that they did and learn some from the mistakes that they made, and without any disrespect toward them, you can do better because they have prepared you to do better than they did. And so that's certainly what Harley and I are trying to do with our kids, and I hope that's what all of you are trying to do with your families as well, at whatever stage in the process you might be. Some of you have kids who are already out of the house. A lot of you have kids who are already out of the house. And again, I was talking with somebody this morning, and I pointed out that Jesus, when he gripes at the Pharisees for the ways that they have gutted the commandment, honor your father and mother, he's not talking about little kids honoring their father and mother. He's talking about adult children who are not honoring their father and mother. Family is forever. Parenting is forever. And that brings us back into our lesson for tonight. As I've said earlier, the yearly focus that I chose for the church in Newburgh is focus on the family. And this morning we looked at the role of husbands and fathers, and particularly we focused on the burden of responsibility. The weight is what I called that lesson. And so this evening it seems appropriate that we should look at the other side of that coin, look at the role of wives and mothers. Now, just like this morning, I hope that when you realized it was about husbands and fathers, that all of the women and children, I hope you didn't just all tune out. In fact, I know you didn't. I certainly don't mean that the men and children should tune out for this because, it's for the ladies. No, we need to understand these things too. It helps us to better appreciate our wives and our mothers, and might help us to raise our daughters better if some of you out there have daughters. Might help you to help her. Might help you to avoid distracting her from what is really her job. And it might help you if you are looking for someone to be your wife and the mother of your children, to start with the right foundation. As we looked at husbands and fathers, we eventually came around to the realization that we just need to look at God. He is the example for us to emulate. Okay, so who's the example for mothers? Well, we don't have a divine example exactly, do we? And there are plenty of people, there are lots of mothers in the Bible, so if we just start at the beginning, Eve. Is that the example that we want wives and mothers to emulate? Maybe not. We don't really know all that much about Eve. Yes, she's the mother of all. That's why Adam gives her that name. But first of all, we don't know that much about her. And then the things that we do know are less than complimentary, shall we say. We see a lot of her failures. Okay, we jump forward in the story in Genesis, and eventually we come across Sarah, and we think, oh, well, great, the mother of the Israelite nation, so to speak. The wife of Abraham, to whom the promises were given, an extremely important woman who is held up as an example, in fact, in one of the passages we're going to look at in a little while here. But while there are certainly things to imitate in Sarah's example, there are some things to avoid as well. Like, nagging her husband. And suggesting that he commit adultery in order to force through a fulfillment of the promises that God has made. And then having the audacity to be upset when she gets exactly what she wanted. Okay, well, if Sarah's not the best example, then maybe we look at the next generation. We might look at Rebecca. And, again, there's some good things to see in Rebecca's example, but how did the whole favorite son thing work out? Not the best mothering tactic, and also not the best wifing, I'm not sure what's the word there, tactic, because she ends up scheming against and undermining her husband, who is supposed to be the head of the household. And here she is trying to vacate his decisions and force through her own will. What about the next generation? Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah. Well, you can already tell that there's something not quite right about this circumstance, and we can't really blame Rachel and Leah for the fact that they are sharing a husband. That's not really their fault. They have been forced into this situation by Laban, who is their father and kind of a jerk. But there are two others involved, Bilhah and Zilpah, who started out as Rachel and Leah's servants, and they end up as wives of Jacob too. And they can't lay that at the feet of their father. They're the ones who suggested it, just like Sarah had done with Hagar. So we've got some good things, and we've got an awful lot of bad things. We jump forward in the story, and the next mother that I would say is prominent is the reading that we've got up here on the screen in Exodus chapter 2. And she's not actually named in this passage. We later learn that her name is Jochebed, but let's read verses 1 through 10 of Exodus 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the children's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now here's a case where it's kind of hard to find anything really negative to say about Jochebed as a wife and a mother. But you'll notice that while there's plenty of good things to say, there's not really all that much that's totally applicable in our situation today. Certainly there are principles and attitudes behind this, but it gets to a broader problem, is just that we don't really have that much information about her. It's kind of like back with Eve. We don't know that much about her, And in Eve's case, what we do know is pretty bad. In Jochebed's case, well, what we do know is pretty good, but it's not that much for us to work from. And that continues on. We look at so many other mothers throughout the Old Testament as we kind of flip through from book to book, and we come across mothers who seem to be great examples, but in every case it's like, oh, there's just not really that much to work from, or it's a very strange circumstance. You've got like the wife of Manoah, we don't even know her name, the mother of Samson, that is the same lady here, and it's hard to say anything bad about her, but we just don't know that much. You've got people like Naomi and Ruth, and, well, their story, while I have really nothing negative to say about Naomi and Ruth, their story is defined by them being not wives and mothers, but being widows and orphans. Or widows and orphans, childless, that's the word I'm looking for. And that changes by the end of the story, but it's not really the paradigm for our ladies to follow. Think about maybe Hannah, some good things there, but you're probably not going to dedicate your child at the temple and have him adopted by somebody else in the way that she did with her son Samuel. Think about Athaliah. No, let's not learn anything from Athaliah. She's horrible. We're left with this problem. We found that it's just really, really hard for us to find a nice, simple example to emulate. And we can't just go to God because He is a father and a husband to the Israelite nation and then to the church in Jesus. And He's not a mother or a wife. That's frustrating. Shouldn't have been a big surprise, because it's not like we see any examples of perfect fathers or perfect husbands in this book except for God. But nevertheless, there it is. But that's not actually how we went about it this morning. Eventually we came around to finding the best example as we looked at fathers and husbands, but we didn't start there. We started with things like descriptions and instructions and abstracts rather than examples. We started in 1 Thessalonians 2, and it occurs to me that didn't only talk about husbands and fathers, it talked about mothers as well. So let's go back there. 1 Thessalonians 2, beginning in verse 7. Again, Paul is talking about himself and Timothy and Silas, who were, all three of them are men, but the role that they fulfilled spiritually for these new Christians included the role of a mother, of whom he says, "But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." And of course, we've got the contrast with the fathers that he mentions later, a few verses down, how they work day and night, and how they encourage and exhort and charge. Got a couple of those reversed, but nevertheless. The difference in the roles is prominent, and this time we're focused on the mothers who give of themselves, who care, who nurture. It's not to say that fathers don't have some of that, but it's obviously heavily weighted toward the mothers. I was sitting there as we were singing some of these songs before I got up and looking down the row at my wife and my kids. And, they've had kind of a long day, as a lot of you with young kids are dealing with some of the same stuff. They're tired and a little bit cranky, and they don't want Dad. They're all huddled around Harley. They all want her affection. They all want her. It's not even an instruction. It's just a recognition of the obvious fact. And that being the case, if you are going to be a wife and mother, Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Do that to the absolute best of your ability. This is how mothers are. Lean into that. Be nurturing and caring. Deliberately give yourself. That's motherhood. Your natural inclination is a start, and just continue to pour yourself into that, and you're on the right track. So that's specific to the motherhood, but we haven't really talked about the role of wife as we have talked about fathers, but we hadn't yet talked about husbands until we backed up in the New Testament to the book of Ephesians. And in Ephesians chapter 5, this morning, we were reading, we started with verses 22 through 24, and let's reread those. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. And that's straightforward. It's something that needs to be said. We need to be reminded of that. But remember, this morning, that's where we focused when we were talking about husbands. We said, look at the instructions for wives, and husbands can learn a lot even from that. Well, why don't we do the same exercise now in reverse? Let's look at what Paul says to husbands and see what we can learn about wives. Keep reading in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Yeah, there's plenty for us to learn about being good wives in the instructions for the husbands. The first thing is that Christ gave himself up to sanctify his wife. Now, that doesn't mean that your husband is perfect and he needs to sanctify you in the same way, because I assure you he is not. But just as the church needed to be purified and sanctified, so do you. You're not perfect. You're not perfect. And that applies to all of us, but particularly here we're thinking about wives. And it's easy for us to say that, but sometimes it's difficult to really admit it to ourselves. But the purpose of your family is to strive toward perfection, together, under the direction of your husband. And he is accountable to God for how he leads your family. Now that raises the question, but what about when he's wrong? He's going to be wrong sometimes. That's an absolute guarantee. And there will be times that he's wrong and you know better. Now, what do you do? Well, there's an outer limit on this, and we're going to get to that in our next passage. But let me give you, as long as we're not talking about situations of where he is trying to lead the family into sin, and it's just he's trying to make an unwise or a bad or a, not the best decision, then you've got some options. You could, let's say, option A, emasculate him and reject God's pattern for how the family is supposed to work, and just bulldoze through and do what you want to do instead. It's an option. You've got option B. Go along with what he says, but make your feelings loud and clear at every possible moment, nag and belittle him over it going wrong, so that in the next instance of him making a decision, he can't take your input seriously because he knows it's just going to be a fight and it's an unfair matchup, or else he's going to have to abdicate his responsibility and let you lead the family. Okay, that's an option. Or maybe something like option C, you could give your input and give gentle suggestions and show grace and care and affection when he ignores them and it blows up in his face, as sometimes is going to happen, so that maybe next time around he will be more inclined to specifically seek out your input and take that into consideration before making the decision. I can't even describe how much I value Harley's input. There's no one else on earth whose input I care about more. Because I trust her. Because I know that we're working together, not against each other, not for our own selfish concerns, but for our joint concerns as a family. We're in this together. As Paul quoted in verse 31, he's quoting from Genesis 2, at the end of Genesis chapter 2. One flesh, the two shall become one flesh. No longer two separate people. You're together. There's a reason that you're supposed to be sharing the same last name here. This is a joint endeavor. And working at cross purposes is not good for anybody. Now, God has instructed your husband to lead, and he's instructed you to submit and follow. And if both sides of this are doing their part, then everybody is going to be happy. And everybody is going to be moving toward heaven. When you work together, when the wife makes the conscious decision to submit in spite of herself, to rely on her husband, to support her husband, and the husband has made the conscious decision to lead and to provide and to protect his family, everything is better. And you can have a wonderful, thriving marriage. And it's not because you're so great, it's because you've both admitted that you don't know what you're doing, and God does. That's something that I've heard a number of times. I've heard about getting married, and I've heard it especially about having kids. When young couples will say, like, I'm not sure, I don't think we're ready to have kids. And sometimes I'll just keep quiet, and other times I'll say, keep that up. If ever you think you're ready, you're not. If ever you think you're ready to take that step, then that's precisely when you should say, let's hold off. Because if you think you're ready, then, well, that's pride that goes before a fall. Of course you're not ready. You're not able to do this on your own. The only way you're going to get through this unscathed, the only way to go back to the analogy from this morning that Solomon used in Psalm 127, the only way that you're going to get your arrows to hit the mark and to get them back unharmed and undamaged is to put God in charge of your household, which is, by the way, the beginning of that psalm. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. We put him in charge and follow his rules and let him lead. As we think about those instructions that God has given here in Ephesians 5 to the husbands, there's another thing that is, I think, very striking. He says that husbands should love their wives. Okay, simple enough, obvious. But what if, as the wife, you make yourself unlovable? How's this going to work out? That's going to be difficult. Now, he still is responsible to do his best. He still is told to love his wife. But you're not making anything easier for him or for yourself, for your whole family. So try to be lovable. What if the wife has made herself impure? The pattern was that Christ cleansed his bride so that she could be spotless, so that she could be without wrinkle. And if you as a wife are making yourself, full of spots and full of wrinkles, what's he supposed to do? He's not Jesus. He can't cleanse you of those in the same way. Now, hopefully he can lead your family in a direction that will get rid of some of those concerns. But once again, you're undermining the purpose of the family in that case. That's not a recipe for marital bliss. And finally, the analogy here, and I guess this was present in verses 22 through 24 as well, that the wife is supposed to submit to her husband as the church submits to Christ. So while we don't have an individual, a nameable individual for the pattern, we could say that wives are supposed to imitate the church. And if you've ever read the the first letter that Paul writes to the Corinthian Christians, and you would say, oh boy, that seems like it's going to be a mess. And you'd be right. It's not that you're supposed to imitate one particular congregation. It's that you're supposed to imitate the ideal form of the church in abstract, which submits to her head, Christ. We move on to the next passage. I said we were going to get to this one that puts an outer limit on the submission that is supposed to be shown by wives toward their husbands. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, well, let's read verses 1 through 6. He starts it the same way. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good, and do not fear anything that is frightening. Every time I read this, I'm struck. I start thinking, why doesn't this passage get more attention? And maybe I'm alone in that. Maybe you guys have already given it plenty here. I certainly hope so. But in my experience, it's like Ephesians 5. We all harp on Ephesians 5, and it's a lot rarer to look at 1 Peter 3. Does submission to your husband extend to denying Christ, if that's what he wants to do? Of course not. That's not the way it works. The goal in this case is to differ from him in a sense. You could almost say disobey him. If he's saying deny Christ, then, well, sorry, but no. But do it in a way that is submissive, that is respectful, that is pure and chaste, so that even though you are, in a sense, disobeying him, you're likely to win him over. Isn't that an amazing thing to think about? That by going against his wishes when they are to push you into sin, you can not only get yourself moving in the right direction, but win him over as well? And that seems so unlikely, and yet I can't tell you how many times I've seen it happen. You've probably seen it happen a couple of times too, where you've got a husband who is an unbeliever and a wife who is a Christian, and it takes some time, but she behaves like this. And before you know it, he's a strong Christian too. And he's not just along for the ride, whatever will keep her quiet. He's in it because he's seen the results. He sees where this leads. He's seen in the conduct of his wife the gospel. The adornment and beautification thing is worth its own discussion, and I would love to spend some time on that tonight. I certainly plan on going into that at home at River Ridge, but unfortunately we just don't have the time. For now, as we think about that adornment and what Peter says about it, I just want to focus in on that one phrase, which is the title of the lesson. And if it's the only thing that you can remember about this lesson, and if you have some young kids, then I realize that is a distinct possibility, then make it this title: A Gentle and Quiet Spirit. If you work to cultivate that, you will be unstoppable. Husbands and fathers are supposed to carry the weight. Wives and mothers are to put on a gentle and quiet spirit. And I'm afraid that often this leads to a misconception that the world holds as they look in, and sometimes because of that, a misconception within the church itself, that because husbands are to be in charge, because husbands are supposed to bring home the bacon, and wives are to submit, wives are to nurse the babies, wives are to be quiet and gentle all the time. And so that means, then, the misconception goes, that they're mostly just kind of sitting at home out of sight of society, speaking when spoken to. They're not really contributing anything but aesthetics and hot meals and the occasional baby. That's not the pattern that God designed for women. That's not even close. As I said, we can't really find a concrete, nameable example for our paradigm of motherhood and wifehood in the Bible. But we can see more of these abstracts. We've already looked at the church. We can see another one in Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs 31, even just the book and chapter probably calls to mind a certain image for a lot of you. I certainly hope so. Let's begin reading in verse 10. An excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of his life. She seeks wool and flax. She works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. This is the essence of an excellent wife and mother. She's gentle and quiet, and she is a powerhouse. She is accomplishing a ton. She is working, she's making money, and she's not, off working some job, making money for some other man. It's for her household. That's where it all comes back. She is preparing her family for whatever comes. She's not worried about it because her husband is fulfilling his role and she's fulfilling her role. And they laugh at the future. They're ready for whatever comes because of her hard work, her use of her intelligence. No one is looking down on this woman. Nobody thinks that she is somehow worth less than a man. No one considers her to be property. No one is thinking that she's like nothing but a womb with a mouth. There's none of that. The level of respect for this woman is enormous. Her children and her husband adore her. Without her, her household couldn't function, just as it wouldn't function without her husband. It wouldn't even be a household anymore. It's really difficult to live up to this pattern. And as verse 10 makes clear, it's pretty rare. An excellent wife, who can find? You don't see these women every day. But you know what you can do? You can resolve to be one of these women. And it's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to flip a switch and suddenly you're like this. But even if you just started at the first line and focused on that and just contemplate that for a while and do your best to emulate what that says, how it applies to you and your situation in your life, and then when you feel like you've spent long enough or you've got that under your belt or whatever, and you move on to the next one. You keep doing that, and you'll be amazed at how the entire world around you gets brighter as a result. And I don't just mean that your perception of the world will get brighter, although it will. But in reality, if you behave like this, you will brighten the lives of everyone around you. So, for the men, help your wives and daughters to be more like this, to be a woman who fears the Lord. And show them some grace when they fail, because they're going to. Just like she needs to show some grace to you when you fail, because we all know you're going to. But more than that, let's remember, for all of us, that the church is supposed to be Christ's bride. We spent a lot of time on that in Ephesians 5. And we didn't really mention it there, but we could say that in some sense the church is also a mother. That's the way John describes her in 2 John. The elect lady, that's the church, and her children, meaning some members of the church. So she's a wife and a mother too. And God's household consists of, well, you've got Christ and you've got his bride, the wife and mother of his children, you might say. The church is supposed to do basically all of these things that we have been discussing. Sometimes even in physical ways, but certainly in the spiritual realm. So even if you're a man, there's plenty for you to learn about this. There's plenty for you to learn about being a member of the bride of Christ. But if you're not a part of that, then it makes you a wandering, purposeless, helpless, spiritual orphan with no eternal home, with no mother to look up at and bless, with no right to call God your father, with no right to expect a home with him. Nothing but despair waits for you then. But in contrast to that, in God's household there is no limit to the love that is available. I mentioned earlier the number of kids that I have. Mark was expressing, I don't know if it was this morning or this afternoon, he said, I can't believe you all fit in here, in this van. And I went, well, we are right at capacity and I'm having to consider getting a big van. God doesn't have to worry about how many kids will fit in his van. There's always room for one more. And so I'll leave you with that tonight. Are you ready to be adopted into his family? If so, then please come now as we stand and sing.